Hi, so let's talk about the multicellular life cycle. So, all organisms that reproduce sexually have what we know as a life cycle. This life cycle starts when you're just a little baby and then you'll mature into a sexually mature adult. That means you can have offspring. So, for human beings, that is when we have reached puberty. So, that could take 10 to 16 years, depending on our genetics. But we will always go through two stages, and that's our diploid stage and our haploid stage. So let's start talking about our diploid stage. So in the diploid life cycle, this occurs within the germ cells. Remember, our germ cells are our gametes. That's our sperm and our egg. And it happens within the reproductive organs. So for males, it would happen within the testes to produce the sperm. And for the females, it starts in the ovaries for the egg production. And so with that diploid stage, these gametes join together in a process called fertilization. The gametes are haploid until they join together to form that diploid zygote. A zygote is the starts of a baby. It's a single cell. We all start as single cells. The difference is once the sperm and egg have joined, they each have 23 chromosomes because they've gone through meiosis. They'll join to form a diploid 2N or 46 chromosome zygote. A zygote will then go into the reproductive stages of mitosis. So it goes from a single cell to 2 cell to 4 cell. 8 cell stage is what we consider the first stage. And then it will form a blastule pore and go off into make what we know as a baby. So our diploid life cycles, meiosis in germ cells, will result in haploid gametes, and then meiosis in female cells will also refer in haploid gametes. So these germ cells will go through what we call oogenesis and spermatogenesis. Oogenesis being egg production, spermatogenesis meaning sperm production. So let's talk about males first because they're a little bit easier. Okay, so males will produce a gamete that we call a sperm. This is a germ cell. And we can see here in spermatogenesis, we start here, we divide, we go from a single cell, we go into our meiosis, 2 cell, and then we end up with 4 haploid sperm cells. Notice the sperm cells are not circular, they have tails, or flagellum is what we call them, so that they can move. They're much different than the female cells. These 4 sperm are genetically different from each other because of 3 absolute reasons. One of them, crossing over has occurred. 2, we have our independent assortment. And then hopefully when they reach the egg, it's a who's going to get there first type situation. And that's when we're going to have that random fertilization occur. So that's how we get genetic variation in you. And that's why all of your offspring from your parents don't look exactly the same, but you might have some same characteristics. So the result is 4 viable haploid cells. Every sperm here is a fertilizable sperm, which means it can join to an egg. These are all viable gametes. Men will produce millions and millions of sperm in a day. So they'll go through this process from the time that they are hit puberty until the time they die. The rate at which it goes will vary for each male, and the duration of that vigor will also vary for each male. So then let's talk about females. Females are a little bit different. We go through something called oogenesis. So our eggs are our gametes. Those are our germ cells. We still go through the same process as males, but you notice in our meiosis 1 at the end of that, we have 2 cells. One is much larger than the other cell. That's done purposefully. An egg is much, much bigger than a sperm cell. Sperm cells are extremely tiny. And so a sperm will actually enter into the egg to fertilize that. These 3 are not viable. These are what we know as polar bodies. They do not have enough cytoplasm in order to create a viable egg. One egg is released every 28-day cycle for a female for the duration of however long she menstruates. And so it is much shorter for women than it is for men. Reproductive years for women can last from 20 to 40 years, depending on the woman. Most of the time, eggs are no longer fertilizable with a high rate of success after the age of 40. So your chances of having a viable offspring that does not have any genetic defects goes down dramatically once you hit 40. The rate goes up once you hit 30, but we notice that you hit 40, for a lot of women, it becomes very high. So what does that mean? So these three polar bodies are not necessarily viable. If they would be fertilized, the pregnancy would be terminated before you would even get to blastopore stage. However, these polar bodies and things like lizards can fertilize this egg in a process called parthenogenesis. Okay, so the polar bodies are removed. So again, repeat. Men, every time you go through meiosis, you get 4 viable gametes called sperm. Women, when you go through meiosis, you go through oogenesis and you get 1 egg, 3 polar bodies. The egg is viable, the polar bodies are not. And we will have all the eggs that we'll ever make when we're born, while men will produce sperm for the rest of their lives. So what's this haploid life cycle? So a haploid life cycle happens in things like fungus, like mushrooms, and protista. And so basically with a haploid life cycle, meiosis produces a diploid zygote in the formation of our first cell, and then a multicellular haploid individual comes around. So if we look here, we went through meiosis. We have these 4 free-selling gametes here. And so mitosis or asexual reproduction occurs. Okay, mom made gametes. Free living cells, these guys. It would be like, oh, hey, I can't find a mate. So now I'm going to be okay with that. And so then it starts growing, and then, I'm going to come in contact with another one, and then I'm going to fuse together. Usually what happens with this is mushrooms will grow these little hyphae. So these little guys right here would actually grow into a full mushroom. And if you notice, there's never just one mushroom. There's like a ton of little mushrooms around. They have a root system, but the root system isn't really a root system, not like in plants. It's called hyphae. It's these little hair or thread-like structures. Think about like a tassel hanging off of a rug. And so these guys will spread out, and then the hyphae, when they come in contact with each other, that's when they'll fuse, and then they'll go into the diploid life cycle again. And that's their form of sexual reproduction. These guys who go through these haploid life cycles do not typically have like a male and female. They're usually a positive and a negative. So they're not gender specific, I guess you could say. They're gender neutral. Okay, then we have alteration of generations. Alteration of generation occurs in plants, and plants can go between a haploid and a diploid life cycle. Cool thing about plants can have on the same plant a male flower and a female flower. Just on a pine tree, you can have female cones and male cones. So they can have both reproductive organs. They're not necessarily what we consider hermaphroditic, but they can have both the ovum produced, and they have pollen, which is sperm produced. And so plants have that option. So alteration of generation makes sense for plants. Plants can also go through things we know as propagation. A lot of you have seen your moms cut off a stem of a plant, put it in water, and then replant it later. That's something that's a little specific to plants, and that's why alteration of generation happens. So in these multicellular, we have what we call a sporophyte phase. This is where they're forming spores, like in ferns, the little black things on the bottom of the fern. They'll undergo meiosis to produce these spores. The spores form a multicellular, multicellular gametophyte. A gametophyte is the haploid phase, and that can reproduce gametes through mitosis. When these gametes fuse together from the gametophyte, that's when the diploid phase comes around. So basically what happens is these haploid little guys will go through mitosis. The sporophyte phase goes through mitosis and it produces basically more spores. Then these spores can kind of fuse. Well, the spores will just find each other and they can fuse, and then they go through a diploid phase, because once they fuse, then you got two of them. This can happen in plants based on pollen and eggs, but most of the time this will happen because they have runners or shoots coming off. They can also go through propagation. There's lots of other things plants can go through to reproduce. Plants are able to survive in the worst conditions. And they're able to come back very easily. So this diploid haploid phase for them works out really well because they can go through the sporophyte, forming these forming these diploid spores, and then go through the gametophyte phase, and that's where they're actually making gametes that will fuse together. And remember, gametes are haploid, so that's an easy way to remember that. Gametophyte is gamete. That's haploid. All right. Thank you guys. Make sure you do your adaptive practice.